I've finished with these shirts.
They look good. This one has a fine stitch.
Your work is always the best.
Thank you.
Subscribe to Wild West Soul Stories. Hit the bell, like, comment, and share. Thanks for watching. The morning sun painted the small town of Copper Springs in shades of gold and amber. Margaret Ellen Hayes stood behind the counter of her modest dress shop, pressing her weathered hands against the wooden surface as she watched another day begin through the dusty window. At 47 years old, Margaret had learned to expect nothing from life except hard work and quiet evenings alone. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away 12 years ago from fever, leaving her with a small inheritance and a broken heart she never expected to mend. She had built this shop with her own 2 hands, stitching dresses for the women of Copper Springs, mending shirts for ranchers, and creating wedding gowns for young brides who still believed in fairy tales. Margaret remembered believing in those fairy tales once, back when her hair was the color of autumn leaves, instead of the silver threads that now streaked through her braids. The bell above her door chimed, and Margaret looked up, expecting to see one of her regular customers. Instead, a man stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light. He removed his worn leather hat, revealing gray-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of weathered oak. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and gentle like distant thunder over prairie grass. "I'm looking for someone who can mend a few shirts. The lady at the general store said you're the best seamstress in town." Margaret felt her cheeks warm, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. "I suppose I'm the only seamstress in town, so that makes me the best by default." The man laughed, a sound that seemed to fill the small shop with warmth. "Well, I'd take your work over any fancy city tailor, I reckon. There's something honest about small-town craftsmanship." He stepped forward, and Margaret noticed the way he moved, confident but not arrogant, like a man who had lived enough years to know his place in the world. She guessed he was close to her age, maybe a few years older, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. "I'm Samuel Walker," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Just bought the old Patterson ranch outside of town. Figured I'd start fresh somewhere new." Margaret shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip and the gentleness behind it. "Margaret Hayes. Most folks call me Maggie, though I'm not sure why. I've never felt much like a Maggie." Samuel tilted his head, studying her face in a way that made her want to look away and hold his gaze at the same time. "Margaret suits you better," he said. "It's a name with dignity, a name for a woman who's weathered storms and come out standing." She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply gestured toward the basket of clothes he carried. "Let me see what you've brought." Over the next hour, Margaret examined his shirts while Samuel wandered through her shop, asking questions about the fabrics she used, the patterns she created, the stories behind the wedding dresses displayed on wooden forms in the corner. He listened when she spoke, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk like so many men did. When he left, promising to return in 3 days for his mended shirts, Margaret stood in the silence of her shop and pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beating faster than it had in years. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "You're too old for such nonsense." But when Samuel returned 3 days later, and 3 days after that with more mending that didn't really need doing, Margaret began to wonder if perhaps she had been wrong about many things. Spring turned to summer, and Samuel became a regular fixture in Margaret's shop. He would bring her wildflowers he picked on his rides across the prairie, claiming they reminded him of her. He would stay for hours, drinking coffee and telling her stories about his years driving cattle across the territories, about his late wife Rebecca, who had died giving birth to a child that also didn't survive, about the loneliness that had followed him like shadow ever since. "I thought I'd never feel anything again," he confessed one afternoon, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I thought that part of me had died with Rebecca, but then I walked into this shop, and I saw you standing there in the morning light, and something inside me woke up." Margaret shook her head, turning away to fold fabric that didn't need folding. "Samuel, I'm not a young woman anymore. Whatever you think you see in me, I see a woman with kind eyes and strong hands, he interrupted, moving closer. I see someone who creates beauty from scraps of cloth. I see courage and grace and a heart that's been broken but keeps beating anyway. And I see someone I want to spend whatever years I have left getting to know. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them back. I'm 47 years old. My hair is gray. My hands are rough from years of work. I'm not the woman I was when I was young and pretty and full of dreams. Samuel reached out and took her hand, cradling it gently in both of his. Margaret, I've been waiting my whole life for you. I just didn't know it until I found you. Age has nothing to do with what the heart wants. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just a man, but a mirror of herself. They were both survivors, both carrying wounds that had healed into scars, both standing at the edge of something that felt too wonderful to be real and too real to be denied. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. So am I, he said. But I'm more scared of walking away and never knowing what we could have been. The summer days stretched long and golden, and Margaret found herself doing things she hadn't done in decades. She rode out to Samuel's ranch on Sunday afternoons, sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains while he played old songs on a battered guitar. She laughed at his terrible jokes and argued with him about whether blue or green fabric looked better on Mrs. Henderson, and found herself thinking about him in the quiet moments before she fell asleep. The women of Copper Springs noticed the change in her. They commented on the color in her cheeks, the light in her eyes, the way she hummed while she worked. Some of them smiled knowingly. A few of them whispered behind their hands, wondering what business a woman her age had carrying on like a schoolgirl. Ma. Margaret heard the whispers, and for the first time in her life, she didn't care what people thought. One evening in late August, Samuel invited her to the ranch for dinner. He had prepared roasted chicken and vegetables from his garden, and they ate by candlelight on his back porch, the stars spreading like diamonds across the velvet sky above them. I want to ask you something, Samuel said, setting down his fork and reaching across the table for her hand. And I want you to take your time answering. Don't say anything tonight. Think about it, sleep on it, consider it from every angle. Margaret's heart began to pound. What is it? He stood, walked around the table, and knelt before her chair. From his pocket he produced a simple gold ring, worn smooth by time but glinting in the candlelight. This was my grandmother's ring, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She wore it for 53 years of marriage. She told me once that love doesn't have an expiration date, that the heart can find its home at any age. Margaret, I love you. I love the way you wrinkle your nose when you're concentrating. I love how you talk to your thread when it tangles. I love how strong you are, how kind you are, how beautiful you are. Will you marry me? Margaret couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face, and she covered her mouth with her free hand, overwhelmed by emotions she had buried so deep she thought they no longer existed. Samuel, don't answer tonight, he reminded her gently. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small bedroom above the dress shop, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the reasons. She should say no. She was too old for this. People would talk. What if she got sick? What if he got sick? What if they were making a mistake born from loneliness rather than love? But every time her mind conjured a reason to refuse, her heart countered with a memory. Samuel bringing her coffee when she worked late. Samuel holding her hand while they walked through town, uncaring of who saw them. Samuel looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. In the morning, she closed the shop early, something she had never done in 12 years, and rode out to his ranch. He was in the barn, brushing down his horse, when she appeared in the doorway. The morning light silhouetted her figure, and he stopped what he was doing, his eyes searching her face for an answer. I spent all night thinking, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. I thought about every reason why this is crazy, why we're both too old for this, why we should be sensible and content with what we have. Samuel's face fell slightly, and he nodded, preparing himself for rejection. But then I thought about something else, Margaret continued, stepping into the barn, moving toward him. I thought about all those years I spent alone, convincing myself that love was something for young people. I thought about how empty my life felt before you walked into my shop, and I thought about what my mother told me when I was a girl. She said that love isn't about finding someone who makes your life easier. It's about finding someone who makes your life worth living. She stopped in front of him, reaching up to touch his face with her work-worn hand. You make my life worth living, Samuel Walker. And if you'll still have me, gray hair and wrinkles and all, my answer is yes. The sound that escaped Samuel's throat was half laugh, half sob. He swept her into his arms and held her close, burying his face in her silver-streaked hair, his whole body shaking with relief and joy. I've been waiting for you, he whispered against her ear. My whole life, I've been waiting for you. They were married in the little church at the edge of town on a crisp October morning. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Samuel wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure. The whole town turned out for the wedding. Even those who had whispered about the impropriety of romance at their age stood in the pews, tissues in hand, moved despite themselves by the sight of two people who had found each other against all odds. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Samuel kissed Margaret with a tenderness that made her knees weak, a cheer went up from the congregation. Mrs. Henderson, Margaret's oldest customer, wiped tears from her eyes and declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. That night in the farmhouse that was now their home, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch, wrapped in a quilt Margaret had made years ago, watching the stars wheel overhead. Are you happy? Samuel asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Happier than I ever thought I could be, Margaret replied. I wasted so many years believing I wasn't worthy of this, believing that love was only for the young and beautiful. You are beautiful, Samuel said firmly. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Not because of how you look, though I think you're lovely, but because of who you are, because of your strength and your kindness and your courage. Beauty like that only grows with time. Margaret leaned into his warmth, feeling a peace settle over her that she had never known before. She had spent so long being alone, being strong, being the woman who needed no one. And now, wrapped in her husband's arms under an endless sky, she understood that strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about being brave enough to let someone in. The years that followed were the happiest of Margaret's life. She moved her shop to the front room of Samuel's farmhouse, and women from towns miles away traveled to buy her dresses and have their wedding gowns made by the woman whose own love story had become legendary in the region. Samuel's ranch prospered, and together they built a life filled with laughter, with work, with the quiet contentment of two hearts beating in unison. They took in a young orphaned girl named Rose, raising her as their own, watching her grow into a fine young woman who eventually married a kind young rancher from the next county. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel gave Margaret a leather-bound journal, handmade by a craftsman in Santa Fe. For your stories, he said, I want you to write down everything, our meeting, our courtship, our life together, so that someday some woman who thinks she's too old for love will read your words and know that she's wrong. Margaret took the journal with tears in her eyes and began to write that very night. She wrote about the morning Samuel first walked into her hop. She wrote about the fear she had felt and the joy that replaced it. She wrote about learning to trust again, learning to hope again, learning to believe in a future she had never dared to imagine. And she wrote about love, real love, lasting love, the kind of love that doesn't fade with age, but deepens with every passing year. When Margaret passed away at the age of 73, peacefully in her sleep with Samuel holding her hand, the whole town mourned. But Samuel, through his grief, found comfort in one thing. For 26 years, he had loved her. For 26 years, she had loved him. And in the journal she left behind, on the very last page, Margaret had written a message just for him. My dearest Samuel, if you're reading this, then I have gone ahead to wait for you. But do not rush. Take your time. Live your days fully, knowing that you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You taught me that it's never too late. You taught me that I was worthy of love. And you taught me that the heart knows no age, no limits, no boundaries. I love you, Samuel Walker. I loved you from the moment you walked into my shop and asked about my sewing. And I will love you for eternity. Wait for me no longer. I'll be waiting for you. Samuel lived another 5 years, tending the ranch, loving their daughter Rose, and telling anyone who would listen about the woman who had changed his life. And when he finally passed, the townsfolk said that a smile crossed his face in those final moments, as if he could see something wonderful waiting for him just beyond the veil. Some people say that love is a young person's game, that romance is wasted on those who have already lived most of their lives. But the people of Copper Springs knew better. They had witnessed something rare and precious between Samuel and Margaret Walker, a love that had bloomed in the autumn of their lives and burned brighter than any summer passion. Because true love doesn't ask your age. It doesn't care about gray hair or wrinkles or the years that have passed. It simply arrives, unexpected and irresistible, and asks only one thing of you. It asks you to be brave enough to say yes.